On this week's exciting episode of the Perry Pod, Frances Cholane is not a girl and not yet a woman, but that's too long for an Earl Stanley Gardner title. He simplified it for Season 1, Episode 5 of The Perry Mason Show, The Case of the Sulky Girl. Welcome to the 5th episode of the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy, and my purpose here is pretty simple. Provide an audio companion to the greatest legal drama in television history, Perry Mason. The goal is to do a pod for every episode of the television series, and if time permits, to cover some of those made-for-TV movies too. I'll be working through the series in the order in which the episodes were aired. Each week, I'll give a brief refresher on the plot, and if the episode was based on a novel, I'll compare the book with its television adaptation. Next, I'll list some key pieces of trivia as well as tackle the episode's main theme. We'll feature a Perry Proverb, a moment of wisdom from the man himself, and then we'll finish with a post-case water cooler, where just like Perry, Della, and Paul, we can rehash the ins and outs of the episode. But first, to the law library! Each week in the Law Library, we'll review previous cases and fill in some details we might have missed. This week, some much-deserved credit goes to my friend Lars Soderlund for planting a bug in my ear about the water cooler section that now ends this podcast. Special thanks to him. Next, let's talk a little more about locations, as in the setting of Episode 4, The Case of the Drowning Duck. Episode 4 was our first Perry Goes Rural case, where our intrepid hero took his legal pyrotechnics show on the road. Logan City, as you'll remember, is the setting of that episode, and it isn't a real place.
Welcome back to Logan City, Mrs. Reed.
It wasn't where Gardner set the novel either, though his location in the novel, El Templo, was equally fictitious. Gardner's location seems to match a basic description of Indio, California. Intriguingly, Indio's nearby desert is where Coachella, the famous arts and music festival, happens each year. I bet you could get a different kind of crowd out to the desert if you got a Raymond Burr hologram to be the headliner. Anybody for Perrychella? Now to this week's case. It's a tale as old as time. A young heiress whose parents died tragically finds herself in line to inherit a bunch of cash when she's 25. The only problem, she's 23 and wants to get married now, and her uncle, Edward Norton, who does not bear any physical resemblance to the actor, though he is fanatical, not unlike some of the classic Edward Norton characters, will not give her the right to marry.
You're contesting a will?
A trust. It'll run over $1 million. I'm willing to pay a lot to break it.
And I assume you don't like supervision.
Not when it's unreasonable.
Irresistible force meet unmovable rock, and thus the sulk.
Forgive me if I acted badly. I'm a little upset this morning.
Yes, I noticed.
As Perry quickly discerns, Fran is particularly desperate because she's not only married already to the painter Rob Gleason, you know who I'm talking about, the famous painter of Biscayne Bay seascapes, but they're also expecting their first child.
You see, you don't quite know everything.
Oh, that was my second hunch. I hope it's a boy.
Norton refuses to budge when Perry tries to move him, and then Norton ends up dead, and hubby Rob gets implicated. The key witness for the prosecution is one Donald Graves, Mr. Norton's secretary, and his eyewitness account of the crime involves him looking back toward the fabulous Norton estate as he's being driven away in a car occupied by Norton's attorney, Arthur Crinston, and uninterested party Judge Perry, who looks sort of like Droopy Dog.
Wait, stop the car.
What's the matter?
The window, Mr. Norton. There's a man in his room. I saw him. He came right up behind Mr. Norton. Go back. Do you hear me? Go back.
Graves, played by William Shallert, a.k.a. Popo from the Patty Duke Show, replicates his identification in a prosecution-assisted trial. Things look pretty bleak for Perry's client. But Perry sees through Shallert's testimony. In his greatest act of legal hocus-pocus yet, Perry gets Graves to read some note cards aloud so that Judge Perry can hear Graves' voice.
In a democracy, all men are created equal.
Now, what was that? I can't hear you, Mr. Graves.
In a democracy, all men are created equal. As the twig is bent, so grows the tree.
Louder, please.
A stitch in time saves 9.
Next card.
Cranston.
Go on, Mr. Graves.
Cranston, I want Graves to go with you.
Read it again, Mr. Graves. Louder, Mr. Graves. Go on!
Cranston, I want Graves to go with you.
It turns out that Graves imitated Norton's voice to cover for Arthur Cranston, the real murderer.
It was Donald Graves' voice.
But I didn't kill him. I didn't. Mr. Cranston killed him. All I did was call down to the car. Tell him, Mr. Cranston. Please, tell him.
Everything's fine and dandy for Fran and Rob, and baby makes 3. A sulky boy? Well, Perry can hope. The Case of the Sulky Girl is the second novel in the Mason series. It came out in 1933 and originally was titled The Silent Verdict. That's because we get Perry in the courtroom unearthing a key fact from Judge Perry, just like in the episode, and though we don't hear a confession from the murderer in the book, we do read Gardner's description of jurors recognizing the truth of Perry's accusations against Cranston with a silent verdict that is deafening. So, let's talk about some of the major differences between the episode and the novel. A, both Rob and Fran are on trial in the book. It's only Rob who's on trial in the television ep. B, in the book, Cranston is Norton's business partner, not his attorney. And C, Clara the maid in the show is a hero. In the book, she's a straight-out blackmailing villain. More about her and Ardella a little later on. Perhaps more worth mentioning for fans of the show are the descriptions we get of Perry and his cohorts in this early novel. Perry, according to Gardner, quote, gives the impression of bigness, not the bigness of fat, but the bigness of strength. He was broad-shouldered and rugged-faced, and his eyes were steady and patient, close quote. Della, we find out from Gardner's novel, is 27, so now you can put an age on Barbara Hale. And number 3, Paul is described as, quote, a tall man with a long neck that was thrust forward inquiringly. Barbara Hale, straight out of the book, in my opinion. Maybe early Raymond Burr matched the Perry description, particularly in this first season, but William Hopper never matched the description of Paul Drake that Gardner gave in the novel, and frankly, that's all right. I think William Hopper is great. Someone on the Perry Mason Fanatics Facebook group mentioned that given these descriptions, William Tallman, if you look at him, would have made a better Drake, and William Hopper would have equally worked for Perry, as Gardner describes him in the novel. As always, it's tough not to see the TV portrayals of these characters as being definitive, even if they don't match the original novel descriptions. And this is just after being immersed in the television show for a few episodes. Now, let's head to the trivia and episode theme park. In our trivia subject each week, I'll give you 3 takeaways, a Paul, a Della, and a Perry. Paul, a subject worth investigating more. Della, something about a particular character in the story. And Perry, something we learn about our main character. Our Paul this week is the title word sulky. The word means a reluctance to be cooperative or cheerful, morose, sullen. A little research on the word reveals that etymologically it means, quote, hard to dispose of. 2 questions for me. Is sulky a trait we see Fran actually demonstrate in the episode? And is it a moral shortcoming? To the first, no. I wouldn't call her sullen. She's more trapped and fiery. In the novel, on the other hand, we get a lengthy conversation between Perry and Della about this very point. I think Perry says, that I put the words in your mouth. You said she looked trapped or sulky. Now I am wondering which it was. Does it make a difference? Asked Della. Della spoke thoughtfully. She looked both trapped and sulky, as though she got caught in some kind of trap and had turned sulky. End quote. This makes Fran's sulkiness not the real problem, but a kind of symptom of her major dilemma, being at the mercy of someone who is thoroughly rational and thus ethically flawed, the fanatical Mr. Norton. Better to be sulky than to be incapable of feeling like Norton, no matter how well-intentioned. To the second question of whether or not being sulky is a moral failing, Fran's real test is that she's taken a while to grow up. Paul has the funniest comment in the entire show about this.
She's a very expensive delinquent.
Maybe she's just taking her time growing up.
So did Two Gun Crowley.
My dad mentioned to me as we watched the episode that given Fran's pregnancy, there might be some explainable emotional variance that Fran exhibits in the moment that might not be part of her deeply rooted character. In any case, the word sulky is one to investigate further. In fact, we'll revisit it in the Perry Proverb. Our Della this week is Clara the housekeeper. Clara offers Fran love and understanding and provides a counterbalance to the overly rational discipline of Mr. Norton.
Somebody had to look after the child, and Mr. Trelane was very pleased that I did.
Was he pleased with the way you helped her defy him? I certainly am not.
Miss Fran needs love and understanding.
She's also the first overt Christian we've had in the show. While initially she's mocked for this belief, even by Perry.
There was nothing I could have done, sir. Whatever was going to happen, it would be in more divine hands than mine.
Would you say the murder weapon was held in divine hands?
She quickly shows herself to be one of the episode's most insightful characters.
You know, Clara, any more of these completely analytical deductions on your part, and I shall be forced to declare you the winner.
In the novel, she's a conniving blackmailer who sees Fran as someone who can get her some cash and thus somebody to be preyed upon. To encounter Clara in the TV show is to encounter the power of an adaptation in full force. Finally, our Perry this week concerns Raymond Burr's impeccable hair. It really has to be seen to be believed. This episode, just on a personal note, may be the most handsome I've seen Burr in any of these early eps. He's always great acting with his eyes, but Burr smiles, gets angry, cracks jokes, shows a range of emotions in this episode, and is just flat out dashing. Perry with the good hair. That brings us to this week's theme. Extremes. We've got opposing extremes. Clara versus Edward Norton. Love versus discipline. We've got the pessimism and optimism represented by Paul and Perry respectively. And we've got extremes of identification. Eyes versus ears in the battle between Graves' identification of Rob with his eyes and Judge Purley's identification of Graves with his ears. Perry's characters are always pitched at emotional extremes. That's just good television. It's how you end up with a show that every week features 5 or 6 people who have a good motive for killing one person. For a true taste of these acting extremes, just watch some of the scenes with the volume down. Pay attention in particular to the way Cranston overacts when he's implicated for the murder of Mr. Norton at the end of the confession scene. Perry, as always, is a temperate man, one who balances discipline with love, realism with optimism. And that brings us to this week's Perry Proverb. Perry drops the episode's final line with a knowing wink.
You know what I'm afraid of? I may have to raise another sulky girl.
Oh, no, I'm holding out for a sulky boy.
What makes Perry really unique is his hope. The beautiful shining faith he mocks Paul for lacking earlier in this episode.
This one looks bad, Perry.
That's your most endearing quality, Paul, your glorious shining faith. I'd rather have your facts and figures.
Rightly addresses what makes Perry so refreshing. He does have beautiful shining faith in his clients, in their innocence. Maybe not their Edenic innocence, but definitely their innocence for the crime they're charged with, and as a result, he saves many a Rob Gleason from the gas chamber. Holding out for a sulky boy? Indeed, because he knows that even sulky boys deserve justice. And now, Time for the post-confession water cooler.
There is one thing I don't understand.
Go on, Paul.
I had the privilege of watching the case of the Sulky Girl this past weekend with my father as we celebrated his birthday. Dad was my original Perry fan, and it was a pleasure to get to rehash the episode with him in real time. On our conversation docket as the episode took place, the cars. Dad could spot that Lincoln Premier that a couple characters drove from a mile away. Number 2, the scenes with Della where 1, she's sitting in Perry's big chair, and 2, the scene in the office late at night where she's fallen asleep. Dad called these before they happened, and I don't know how long it's been since he's seen the episode. The point is, the dude has the show memorized. 3, he also pointed out that the Chalane Norton mansion gets reused many other episodes, and that the interiors of the house are not inside an actual house, but are obviously sound stages. And then finally, we got a hilarious laugh out of Paul's shining faith. Again, I'd love feedback about this particular episode or the podcast in general. Was there something about this week's pod that you'd like to comment on? Something that you'd like to correct? You can leave comments on the pod's website at theperrypod.libsyn.com or email me at theperrypod@gmail.com. You'll find those links in the show's notes. Thanks again for joining me on this pod journey. Next week, we tackle an oddity in the Perry universe, a show with no courtroom drama at all. The Case of the Silent Partner. Until next time, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Fifth Avenue beat.